So if you're just joining us and getting settled, we're going to start in 1 minute. Just to let people kind of get settled as they're coming in, maybe from their lunch hour, or if you're on the West Coast. I'm sorry, it's kind of bright and early for you. Perfect. So it looks like we have a good chunk of people joining us. So I'm going to go ahead and get started because I know this hour is precious. So good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on implementing and monitoring professional learning programs. I'm Carly Norton and I'm your host. I'm also the Director of Marketing at KickUp, which is a company of educators working with school districts and PD providers nationally to power their professional growth cycles and to assess their programmatic impact. So across our work, one of the most common questions that we're hearing is, I just launched a new program. I'm really excited about the impact that it can have on instructional practice, but how do I make sure that it's successful past the launch? And so today, we're hosting a conversation with two partners who are doing just that. They're implementing large, ambitious programs, and they're using data to drive towards fidelity. So specifically, we're going to talk through the how and the why of focusing on fidelity. We're going to go through some tips from real-life implementations, from Kim and Greg's real implementations for incorporating progress monitoring into their rollouts. And then we're also going to confront the reality of making adjustments mid-year, which hopefully will feel very relevant to those of you who are joining us now, as we are currently mid-year. And so there's some reality to confront. So to give you an overview of how we're going to spend that time, we're going to start with some brief introductions. Then we're going to jump right into those two program implementations, and we'll have Q&A peppered through that. So you should see at the bottom of your screen, at the very bottom, there's a little Q&A question. Feel free to drop questions in at any point throughout the webinar, and we'll make sure to address those either at the Q&A section at the end or kind of feeding it throughout. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with a few takeaways, and we have a couple goodies and free resources to give you guys to thank you for spending some time with us. So let's get started with that in mind. I'm really excited to introduce you to two of our education leaders who are on the call here today. Our first guest is Kim Swartz, who is the Director of Instruction at Central Rivers AEA in Iowa. And Kim, do you think you could tell us maybe just one or two lines, sort of what your role is at Central Rivers?
Well, I am the Director of Instruction. Our agency works with school districts across Iowa, and we support special education, professional learning, media, and technology. And in my role, I work specifically around the professional learning area, and I work really intensely with three teams: our literacy, our math, and our school improvement team. So what I will probably be sharing today is around the work that we're doing with our literacy and our math team.
Perfect, great. And Greg, not to be left out, Greg is the Deputy Chief of Data at Youngstown City Schools. And Greg, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your role there as well.
Sure. As you mentioned, I'm the Deputy Chief of Data, and what that kind of means is work right hand in hand with our Chief Information Officer, sort of as the bridge between collecting data and using it with our instructional leaders, whether it be building principals, coaches, teachers, just kind of helping them collect, analyze, and then put some strategy in around whatever that data may be.
Awesome. Cool. So I want to start by grounding our conversation today in the real life programs that you're implementing in your organizations. So we want to just sort of build some context about what these programs do and what their goals are. So I'll start with you, Kim. Can you tell us just a little bit about Central Rivers, especially for people on the call who aren't familiar with AEAs in Iowa, kind of what your organization does, and also what professional learning programs, the scope of your professional learning program.
Yeah, so we are an intermediate agency in the state of Iowa. Iowa has 9 AEAs. We are located in Cedar Falls, Iowa. We serve around 66,000 students. We have 53 public schools that we work with, and we have 18 non-public school districts. We have about 5,000 educators that rely on our agency for services, as I said earlier, in special education, media and technology, instruction, curriculum, professional learning. And we are across 18 counties and 9,000 square miles. And at one point in time, I heard our agency is about the size of Rhode Island. I don't know if that's true or not, but I will tell you that we do a lot of traveling. We're in our cars a lot. But the programs, we do professional development in a lot of different areas. The programs that I'm going to talk about today are more focused on instructional strategies in literacy. We are also working in the area of math, and we're really helping to support our schools to get a multi-tier system of support in place. And we incorporate that into the professional learning that we do in all of our areas. A few years back, we realized we were providing a lot of professional learning, but weren't really getting kind of the outcomes that we were hoping for. And so we started learning about the concerns-based adoption model, or we call it CBAM. So we've done some work with CBAM, which is helping to implement programs. Especially, we really started looking at innovation configuration maps, or what we call IC maps, where we paint the picture of if you were implementing this with fidelity to what it should look like, this is what it might be. And I'll talk more about that, and I think we have some examples of those later on as well.
Perfect. Thanks. So Greg, same question, and sorry, our slides are just a second delayed here. But want to hear about what you're really focused on at Youngstown.
Okay. Yeah, just to kind of to follow Kim's model there, just a little bit about Youngstown. We are much smaller than Kim's organization. We are about 5,400 students strong. We have about 13 school buildings, 450 teachers. And what's unique about Youngstown is we actually had a piece of state legislation put in for our district. You know, we are a city school system that has been in transformation for quite some time. And so they enacted a little piece of legislation to allow a CEO to kind of take some unilateral control. And so the things I'm talking about are coming out of what our CEO was doing. And so his focus was really getting to the root of, you know, good quality instruction across the district, and looking at that through the lens of the gradual release of responsibility, which GRR, which our teachers worked on implementing. And so how we observed that, monitored that, and, you know, kind of based some of our direction on how well that implementation was going. So some other pieces that we're starting to do from that are integrating some other focus areas like literacy and PBIS off of that, and kind of align to make sure that all the things we're doing are in support and within that framework. So we're talking about a lot of adult implementation data, and really trying to make sure that that is getting done well to hopefully drive our student academic data.
Awesome, great. So now that, you know, we have a sense of the what you guys are working towards, let's talk about the why. So really the story of this past decade in K-12 education has revolved around this idea of evidence for practice. And so with ESA's definition of professional learning, it's really clear that programs have to be linked to research that shows impact on students. And so what that typically looks like here, as you can see, an academic has an idea, or an implementer has an idea. They design and they fine tune their intervention, their field trials, and we get some evidence that it can work. And so it goes on this approved list that in best cases, districts are drawing from, you know, to use and to implement within their own districts. And so the next step there is implementing that, that intervention with fidelity. And then practice improves. So and ultimately what's not on this map, of course, is that student outcomes change. And so the instruction to our students is better, and so the outcomes change as well. But when you look at this map, and when I first saw this slide, I was just struck by how much they just kind of slip that in there, like educators implement with fidelity. It sounds so easy when you just read it on the map, but really what goes into that is quite complex. And so that's really what we're kind of going to focus on today is fidelity. So I think there's a lot of power in starting with a definition. So we pulled a definition of this just to ground ourselves with. But put simply, we measure fidelity to understand whether or not our implementation was true to the design of the program. And so typically when we're talking about fidelity, one of the models that I pulled this morning off of the National Implementation Research Network, which just a side shout out to them. They have a really great suite of tools if this is something that you'd like to dig into more. But you can see here that there are some implementation drivers that really feed into achieving fidelity. And so around the triangle, we have the 3 different types of implementation drivers, the organizational drivers, which are really the systems that support and power your intervention. We have the leadership drivers, and then the one that we're really going to zoom in and focus on today, which are the competency drivers, the coaching, the training, and the selection of the educators who are implementing the program. And so all of those things feed into fidelity, and it's only by really achieving that fidelity that we move to what we ultimately want to achieve, which is a sustainable program that has consistent use of those innovations, and then the improved outcomes. And of course, because this is science, we have some evidence that says this works. And so all the words on this slide summed up say that programs that are implemented with fidelity compared to those that aren't yield effect sizes that are 2 to 3 times higher. So we're talking significant difference. So it's more than just dotting your T's or dotting your I's and crossing your T's. It's really getting to these significant and sustainable outcomes. So that's just a very breezy way of going through the science behind it. But I really want to hear from Greg and Kim, aside from this science that's behind it. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your why within your professional learning programs. Why are you focused on monitoring fidelity and improving fidelity? And I can start with Greg.
Sure. Speaking from Youngstown's lens, we are a district that had been in, constant struggle of achievement for over a decade. And so with that kind of comes that constant turnover of every 3 to 5 years of a new leader that has a new program to do. And basically what we've had is, okay, we're going to do this. And then we give you a piece of, professional development. We say, go do it. And then we wait to see if it works. And really for us, time and time again, that wasn't enough. Going beyond that, here's some professional development. Now we expect you to go do it exactly like we taught you the first time isn't realistic. And so we really need to monitor what's going on in our classrooms and for us, it was GRR and setting just a good foundational set of instructional practices. And just like students, teachers, when they're doing something new, they don't get it right the first time. And it's important to give feedback on what teachers are doing right or maybe incorrectly so that they can yield the outcome that they want. So again, just going back to that, fidelity definition, if we're not doing it the way that it's intended, we're not going to see the results. And I think that over time, Youngstown really saw a bunch of that where things were being implemented but not done with fidelity. And so we really stuck to a very rigid structure. When we put this in place, we rolled out a piece of our gradual release responsibility, one section at a time, followed it up with monitoring and coaching over about an 8-week period before moving on to the next one. So we really wanted to try and say, hey, we're doing this right. here's what you need to do before giving them a widespread framework. And so that was kind of our approach to it, is kind of making sure that we're giving that feedback rather than on a very regular basis, rather than only once or twice a year, because you're not going to grow unless you're kind of getting that constant feedback.
And I would, oops, I would say that our why is probably somewhat similar. In the state of Iowa, our literacy achievement hasn't really progressed the way that we want it, or math. And so we just know that we need to help support that work with our schools. And we've felt like we've provided really good professional learning for teachers, but kind of like Greg, you know, go forth and see what happens. And we decided we couldn't do that anymore, and we really had to be in this together and do follow-up support. So really just thinking about, how do we do that? How do we watch that implementation? How do we coach? How do we provide that feedback and that monitoring? And so that's really where in the last couple of years, we've really just tried to put more of our focus on, after the professional development, what is it that we want to do to be in there working hand in hand with teachers to make sure that it's getting implemented the way that it is expected to. So we've tried to become more partners in that process of looking at implementation and giving them time to practice, just like you said as well, Greg, because at first it's clunky. And so how do we give them time to practice and then give them feedback to help support what next steps might be?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that first part, it's clunky's almost too nice of a word. It's messy, you know? And I think, you know, you got to be in there with them, like you said, to give them support, because I think that's part of that's really showing that, you know, you're willing to work with them and avoid that monitoring as, you know, a punitive thing and more of a coaching thing.
Right?
Yeah.
The other thing that I think we've really tried to do in our work is that we don't want it to be seen as the AEA coming in and doing this to teachers. We're working on this together, and we've really tried to incorporate in the coaches within the building so that they're a part of this, they're a part of the observations, part of looking at that implementation, as well as the administrators, because that's the other thing that we've learned. We all know that the leadership is really important in the school, and how do we help those administrators to increase their knowledge about what it should look like as well. So we're really trying to be a partner with all of those different roles within the schools as well.
Great. So I know that one thing that is common between both of your implementations is a framework that underlies both. And I think they're both really great frameworks that clearly paint the picture of what success looks like. And so I know we have an example pulled from Central Rivers here. Kim, maybe you could just explain a little bit of what we're seeing here and how you use it.
Okay, so as I talked about before, we have worked with the CBAM model, and the CBAM model actually has 3 tools. The Innovation Configuration Map is just one of them. But what an Innovation Configuration Map does is it really helps to paint the picture of what the innovation should look like if you were implementing it with Fidelity. So we use the current research on what best practice should be and put it into this kind of an innovation configuration map. So if you look at this, what it really shows is columns A and B paint the picture of, if you're doing it well, this is what it should look like. We want people over in A, but if they're in column B, we know we're getting where we need to be. The additional columns are more of what we say non-examples. So what this does for teachers is that they can look at this and self-reflect, like, where am I at in this process? And it doesn't matter, as Greg said earlier, it's not about punitive, it's not about I gotcha, it's about where are you and how can you move to the next step to get to where you need to be. So we use this innovation configuration map, and this is just a small portion of it, but we use this to when we go in and do observations where we feel teachers are, and then teachers also do their own self-reflection. And one of the things that we do is we compare that. So where do teachers think they are compared to what do we think we're seeing as we do observations? And then we can have those conversations as well with individual teachers. You know, are we on the same page or are we not? What do we need to do to get there? And one of the interesting things is early on when teachers self-reflect, what we notice is they mark themselves closer on the left-hand side than the right-hand side usually. And so if we do this a couple of times during the year, many times what we see is the second time, it looks like they've regressed, but it's not really that they've regressed. It's just they didn't know what they didn't know at the beginning. And now they're like, you know what, I really am not where I thought I was. So this is the framework or the tool that we use to collect the data to help us look at patterns and trends.
Great. And I'm so glad you mentioned that. That's something we see across all of our partners here at KickUp as well, that there's that little dip. You expect, you know, your perfect linear line to go up, but that dip is a really great sign that they're continuing to gain knowledge and skills at assessing their own knowledge and skills.
Right.
And so Greg, I think we also pulled a slide here with some of the indicators from your framework as well. So maybe you could talk to us just a little bit about the GRR and how you use it.
Sure. So GRR, if you're not familiar, gradual release of responsibility is simply put, you know, I do, we do, and then you do. So, you know, I as the teacher, I'm going to show you what I want you to do or learn or master, then we're going to do it together. Then you're going to do it maybe with a classmate or maybe on your own, depending on what that skill or lesson happens to be. So that's in a very concise nutshell, that's the GRR framework, but we've really kind of broken apart each one of those segments and we developed these over time and put together, just like Kim's, you know, some pretty clear indicators as to whether or not, you know, you are doing those things in your classrooms. And we broke it up, as you can see here, into 7 different sections within that lesson so that, you know, administrators, coaches that are going into a classroom, you know, they aren't necessarily going in at the same time every time. And so we wanted to make sure that wherever they were, they could, you know, make some feedback on the particular section that they're going to. Also, we took this, you know, one section at a time so that we could focus on one. So when you look at a wide rubric that has all these parts, I mean, it's overwhelming as an observer, let alone as the teacher getting the feedback. You know, you don't want to hear, you know, 100 different things coming at you at once because you won't know where to focus on what's going to help you improve. So within this, we build in a piece called a bite-sized action step that the teacher would receive. And that was from the observer's point of view, what's the one thing that if it was a small change that I could make between this lesson and the next lesson, that's going to help my students learn better? You know, maybe that's just as simple as taking an anchor chart and moving it from, you know, an area that's far away that's easier for students to access, or, you know, just a different way of assessing the students or pushing their rigor, things like that. Among some of the other feedback they get, but, you know, just trying to make that feedback network a little bit easier for, you know, our coaches and principals to the teachers so that they are on the same page and able to do, you know, small bits, more coaching size bits, rather than looking at it as an evaluation. So we kind of looked this and took this framework and applied it across, you know, our K-12 schools and just kind of allowed principals to focus in on the areas that they felt their teachers really needed.
Cool. And so we're going to take 1 second real quick just to try relaunching our slides. We're hearing some conflicting news about some people who are having slides get stuck and some who aren't. So we're just going to try it one more time to launch them and then share them. Just 1 second. Okay, they should be loading. And you should be seeing, I'm going to jump to the next slide. You should see it change to a slide that says implementation plan. If you're not seeing that, please use the Q&A just to let us know so we can see if there's any other troubleshooting we can do. But I'm going to move us forward to, from the framework. The framework is a great first step, and it's a necessary first step. But it's not the full step of planning the implementation. And so here we actually are going to pause briefly to ask an audience question of, when you're really planning your implementation, what strategies do you use to put that foundation in place so that it's a successful launch and start of your implementation? And you guys should see a little window pop up that gives you some options. So just respond to that. And while you're doing that, I think I can move to the next slide. I don't know who put me in charge of all the technology here, but you guys are all benefiting from it. And so I jumped too far. Oh no, there we go. Perfect. So one of the things that comes out like across the board is you obviously can't just say go for it and without putting those foundations in place. So Greg and Kim, whoever would like to jump in, I'd love to hear, like, in addition to that framework, what did you really put into place to make sure it was successful getting started?
Well, I think for us, the IC map, was really important. That's one of the first things that we had to do because, as I said, that paints the picture of what this should look like. And that, again, was part of the concerns-based adoption model. And then I think, putting together that training, ongoing. So this is not a one and done by any means. This is an ongoing. In fact, we talk to districts about, you need to think about being with us for 3 to 5 years. And we've had lots of conversations with our districts about what does this mean. So that's a little bit where we're different from Greg because they are a district, but districts can choose to do this work with us or not, but we want to be really upfront with them about this takes time and it is hard work and it's tough work and we need the administration to be in on it with us. We need their coaches because we're building their capacity of their coaches to take over and do this work. So having those conversations up front is really important. And then what we've been able to do now is to say, we have a tool that we can collect data around that we've never had before, that we've been able to have these really powerful conversations because we can start to see at a building level what might be going on or at a grade level what could be happening or for individual teachers. So being able to collect that data from those IC maps and actually having it there to have conversations with the administration or with the leadership team from the building has been really powerful and has driven what our professional learning looks like in the future because of that.
That's great. And Kim, we actually have an audience question. So someone's Kevin here is breaking the stereotypes of webinars in which people don't participate. And Kevin wants to know, Kim, how many days of training did your staff need on the IC maps when you first began using them?
Well, it varies because a few years back we had about 5 days of training for our whole entire agency, but through attrition and those kinds of things, we have people coming and going. So what we really do is we work within our teams to help learn that information. So it's kind of an ongoing learning that we do at this point in time. But I would say, well, I don't know, it's hard to classify how long, but it's ongoing. And the other thing is it takes a long time to put these IC maps together. It's not something that you do overnight. So when we worked on our literacy IC map last year, we only had 4 components that we worked on and that we got really good at and we put into KickUp and started doing. And then over the summer, we did the rest of it. And it takes a long time. It takes a few months to put those together, even though we're using them, they're based on research. So I don't have a really good answer for like how long, but it's ongoing learning. I don't know if that's helpful or not, or if I need to follow up with that, but.
So the poll is in, and one thing I wanted to just call out was that the breakdown of the responses, the most common strategy is relevant to what you just shared, Kim, is building this like in-depth team knowledge and using those maps to socialize that among the team. Interestingly, and a really great segue for us is that the two lowest were developing a monitoring system, so that training is. You guys stated in the poll, that's really helpful for us to know what to focus on as we go forward. And as I said, you really did queue us up perfectly, because the next thing we wanted to talk about is, once it's launched, how do you monitor whether or not you're achieving fidelity? And for this section, I pulled some slides from the Carnegie Foundation, which is another one of the organizations that I'll shout out as having really great improvement science resources. And what this slide is showing here that you're seeing is really this typical approach to change, is that we have an idea for change, we put really good planning into place, and we frequently still don't get to quality that's also reliable at scale. And so what Carnegie argues and what improvement science really argues is that the missing piece there is data and cycles of data that allow you to get feedback iteratively and make those changes as you're going. But again, that's the science, and we're here to talk about what practitioners are actually doing. So Greg, I think you and Youngstown have done a really great job of collecting data, this data that's kind of in the middle here, to assess your implementation. I'd love to hear how you're using that framework during the year to monitor its rollout.
Yeah, when we started rolling out, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, the gradual release framework has some subcomponents to it. We started with just some of the basics. And what we did is we kind of created our own little learning cycle on it. So what we would do is we would train our administration and coaches first. The next week we would train our teachers. And then we would kind of say, okay, let's go do it and let's see what we're actually doing. And we had a requirement of, see every teacher, once a week and provide feedback on that little piece that we're supposed to be doing. And so that really helped us collect a lot of data. And so that was allowing us to kind of see, okay, where amongst a building, a district, grade level, or a team, where are we seeing the people that are struggling with it? And so that was kind of our immediate feedback, is that we were taking it a little bit slow, kind of going back to that, gaining that team in-depth kind of knowledge, making sure everybody's on the same page before moving forward with, that whole framework. Because, simplistically, GRR is not a difficult concept, but when we look at the specific things we wanted everybody to do to really have that solid foundation of teaching techniques, we wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page. So we would, set internal goals of how much data we wanted to collect. And once we got that, we would, produce a regular review of it. Every 5 weeks, we were looking at this data along with some other points to kind of see how this was coming along. And so those conversations between, central office and building administration were kind of key in, guiding where we should be looking for improvement.
Yeah. And Greg, who was doing most of these walkthroughs, and how did you prioritize them internally?
Yeah. Well, we had teams of, every building had, a principal, an assistant principal, and a coach of some sort. And between the three of them, they were, tasked with getting, what we called learning tour per teacher. And these weren't meant to be long. These were just, 10 minutes, pop in the classroom, give some feedback, and come back. And so, those teams were able to get that done when they divided up and look at certain teachers. internally, when we would review it, we would look and see, you know, by teacher, where are we having those struggles? What are we seeing in the classroom outside of our visits as well? You know, is this something we're seeing when we're walking through? And does it change when we just kind of walk by and not actually go in the classroom? So some of those outside the data implementation notes were kind of taken into consideration, and we looked at prioritizing, you know, where we needed some of that support. And, you know, our coaches were the ones that were kind of the most flexible in terms of getting in and working with the teacher side by side.
Yeah. And I know that you shared with me, Greg, about kind of the evolution of the bite-sized action steps, that it, you know, at first can feel like I have someone in my classroom pretty frequently as a teacher can feel a little overwhelming and sometimes scary. But I've seen in your data the change from at the beginning when you started doing observations to once teachers start to see like this feedback is really intended to help me, it's not punitive, that people start craving that data.
Yeah, so one of the things that we did with those bite-sized action steps is really look at, let's say I as a coach go in, and then the next time it's a principal or an assistant principal happens to see you, they have the ability to look and see what was that action step and if you actually took that step.
Right.
And kind of provide some feedback on there, or, you know, kind of ask and follow up in one of those coaching sessions, you know, what is your barrier to, you know, making those little changes. And really the data, when, you know, amongst our buildings, the ones that were really looking at it were the ones that, and showing the most improvement were the ones that took it and utilized it as conversation moments, those coaching moments, and really looking at sitting down with teachers to say, okay, look, this is where we've come, and these are where the goals we want to set for you. And when it was kind of individualized and talked about on that specific level, there it was more receptive rather than that, okay, here's feedback, I'm moving on to the next person.
Right. It's a great point. And Kim, we don't want to leave you out. So we'd love to hear from you how, I think we pulled up some data from your dashboard as well, but would love to hear how you're using the progress monitoring, what structures you're putting into place and how you're using the data.
Yeah, so when we go out and do observations, we meet with either the administrator and the coach or sometimes the leadership team. It just really varies among schools how this happens, but we pull up the data to see where they're at, and we look at it and slice it and dice it in lots of different ways. But we always have those conversations so that we know what are the next steps, what are we seeing, and what do we need to do next based on this data. And that's kind of where I said before, we never had the opportunity to do that because we didn't have the data to look at. So this tool has really given us the opportunity to be able to do that. But one of the other things is that inter-rater reliability. So we have 12 literacy consultants that are going out to do this work. So first of all, sorry, am I jumping ahead?
No, it's fine. I just want to put up a slide so we can, but you're queuing us up perfectly.
Okay. Yeah, it's really important that we're all on the same page. So we have this IC map, but what is that? How does that come to life in the classroom, and what does that look like? And do we all have the same agreement about what that is? So we really focus on that inter-rater reliability amongst our team. We look at videos of instruction, and we rate it on an IC map, and we have conversations about that. But we also do the same thing when we're out doing observations with coaches and administrators. We have those conversations too about, okay, so here's what I saw, what did you see? And we try to come to some inter-rater reliability with them as well, so that we're comparing apples to apples, so to speak. And then again, like Greg said, the part that's really beneficial to teachers is to have that conversation afterwards. And we do that in different ways. It could be our literacy consultant that might have that conversation. It could be in combination with the coach and the administrator. It could be just the administrator. It could be the coach. It just varies within buildings and what that schedule is like when we're there. But again, it's that bite-sized piece of information, like, here's a compliment, here's something you're doing well, and here's a bite-sized piece of information about maybe a consideration for next steps. And then again, as Greg said as well, we have that action step. So the next time we go in, this is what you said you were going to do. And so how's that working for you? So
yeah,
yeah, individually and across the building, it helps us to look at that.
Yeah, and what I have pulled up here now, Kim, is a screenshot from your dashboard. I'm wondering if you could give us kind of the context behind it and how, like, what impact this had for you guys.
Yeah, so what this is showing is in one of the areas that we are looking at, on the left-hand side, you can see 58% of teachers received an A or B on their observation, and that is actually kind of what Greg's talked about, the I do, we do, you do part of it. And so what we're looking at there is the A and B category of the IC map where the blue triangle is. So we see that 58% of the teachers that we observed were placed in that A or B category. And then on the right-hand side, this is where teachers reflected and where they felt they were. So 84% of the teachers feel like they are either in that A or B category. So this is large group, this is at a building level, but what it helps us to see is when we're doing observations, we're not seeing teachers in necessarily those categories where they're seeing themselves. And it kind of goes back to that whole idea about sometimes at the beginning of the year, they mark themselves higher because they think they are doing something because they don't know what they don't know. But the implication for us is, so let's dig deeper. Let's see where those differences are, and then what kind of professional learning do we need to provide based on that. So that's just one way that we look at the data, comparing observations and self-reflection.
Yeah, Kim, you mentioned that inter-rater reliability, and that's so big. We had a case for when we were implementing, you know, I talked about these short cycles, but what we didn't realize was kind of like the revisiting of some of those pieces. And so like the middle of the year, you know, our academic team with our CEO that developed what they envisioned our framework to look like in the classroom, you know, they did some of their own walkthroughs just kind of to see how things were going because our data was looking pretty, you know, pretty high. And here, it was not the envisionment that he had, and so what we were able to do is we had actually, you know, in Ohio we had a couple snow days in a row, so we were able to utilize one of those and pull all of our administrators in and sat and watched film of teachers teaching and had those, you know, side-by-side conversations of, does this look like this piece of evidence to you? Well, what makes it that piece of evidence? How do we know? Are we looking for the right things? Because when you go across, I mean, we're across a much smaller district than the area that you cover, but having everybody on the same page is incredibly difficult. And so those like recalibration meetings, so to speak, really, you know, struck a chord with our, you know, the people that were doing these observations. And without it, I think we would have definitely been over self-inflated rather than, you know, having some other people have that critical look and that critical eye of, you know, what we should be seeing. So can't speak enough to, you know, having that inter-rater reliability, you know, on having people on the same page.
There's been some struggles. Our literacy team really realizes that we need to keep coming back to that. And as we've added more components to that IC map, to come back and look at a lesson based on this part of the IC map versus this part. But we know how important it is, and so we try when we get together to do that. And I think especially at this time of year, it's really important because sometimes you do stray. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I equate it to this. We're also working on some PBIS implementation, and one of the big things that's echoed in there is, you know, after an extended break, you know, you got to come back and reset the tone of expectations and things like that. Well, just like that with going in and expectations for teaching, it's the same thing. Got to go in and, make sure that everybody's on the same page and that we're setting the bar at the same level.
I'm curious from a practical standpoint for someone on the line, if they're thinking about their own rollout, what is the timing that you'd recommend for really looking at the inter-rater reliability and addressing it?
Well, I feel like you have to do that right away. That has to be started right away. Everybody has to be on the same page. So at the very beginning when you start, it's really important. And I guess I would say it's an ongoing thing that you need to continue to do. But, for sure at the beginning and then partway through, you need to come back and recalibrate, kind of like Greg said. That from our side, I would say that anyway.
The only thing I'd add to that, Kim, would be saying when you're planning your rollout, it's obviously when you're starting whatever you're planning on rolling out, everybody needs to be on the same page. But in your overall scheme, maybe it's 1 year, maybe it's 2 year, maybe it's 3 or whatever you're looking at. Wherever you're going to be at, 100% implementation, with Fidelity, you got to walk yourself back in your plan and say, okay, where are we going to make strategic checks to make sure everything's aligned and build in that time. I think that's going to give you the results that you're really looking for, is if you actually take the time to say, okay, hold on, let's take a week or two here and go back to this piece that we first started with, or, we did okay, but not as good as the other parts. And if you do that, I think you're going to have much better results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I like the point too, to that, Greg, that, at that, after you've gotten a little bit into it, people now are used to completing observations or whatever kinds of data you're collecting. You're able to pull up those examples where we can see really clearly, like, what is different about one example versus the other and what makes one stronger. So that's
Absolutely.
great.
Even with, and I'll add one more point, that is, not just how you're rating, but also the feedback you're giving. Mm-hmm. We struggled with that a little bit too, where, feedback was very minimal. And so teachers weren't getting out what they, could have. And so really kind of putting up some anonymous pieces of feedback and having discussion, if you were the teacher getting this, how would you feel? Not so much that it was negative, but it was just, there wasn't anything to the feedback that would help you grow. And so.
Yeah, and Greg, we've worked around that as well. We've really studied Hattie's work around feedback and what that should look like, because that's really an important piece as well. The other thing that I think we, I don't know if I want to say we've struggled with it, but it's really been something we've had to think about because we work with multiple schools. Just getting into those schools and doing those observations becomes a challenge for us. And so we've really had to work with the districts around, we're going to be in there a minimum of once a month, but you need to be doing observations more often than that. And we need to make sure that every teacher is getting an observation and that all teachers are being provided that feedback. So we actually came up with a document about sort of, if you join us in this work, here's what you can expect from us as an AEA, and here's what we expect from you as an administrator, and here's what we expect from you maybe as a coach and as a leadership team. And that's helped us as well when we're starting, so the district knows, this is tough work and there's a lot of work, a lot of expectations, but we're willing to do this if you're willing to work with us. And that's been really helpful to have that up front and kind of ongoing and creating a plan about how are those observations going to happen and how are we going to make sure that teachers are getting feedback. And we like to do the feedback face-to-face, but there is a nice function to the KickUp tool that we use if we need to, and that is that you can actually email that feedback to that teacher. So if there's just no way somebody can get in there to have that face-to-face conversation, we at least can be able to send an email to them.
Well, we have a bunch of really great audience questions. So I want to make sure we have some time for those. And I'll start with Maureen's question, which is to both of you, I believe. Are you able to connect professional learning, change in practice, and improve student outcomes? If so, how do you show that the student outcomes are connected to the professional learning? which is just such an easy question, right?
I was gonna say, I'll let Greg start.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kim. That's not an easy question to answer, but here goes. Connecting professional learning to student improved outcomes. Gosh, there's so many things that can be going on. I guess if you kind of really just kind of use your lens and you pull your data, you look at the things that you're doing that show student outcomes. So if you're doing PBIS, relate that to discipline referrals. For academic improvement, depends on what you're using. For example, I'll say that at Youngstown we have DIBELS as a benchmark assessment in our younger grades, and then we use NWEA MAP in some of our 4 through 12. So connecting that, we really can look at our cycles of implementation in GRR and those benchmark scores. And so that's the connection we try to make. And some of our teachers, although not all of them, do utilize one of our platforms for some short cycle assessments, which we're able to kind of draw out and see if we're seeing the same kind of positive effects. Are we seeing a teacher improve and the student achievement improve? It's very hard because it depends on what level or lens you're looking at. Are you looking at district-wide, a building, a teacher? But just trying to isolate those individual things are difficult. But if you isolate the two things that you're really looking at, for us looking at GRR and students' achievement on maybe our state assessment, that's a little bit harder because of the chunk of time. But if you look at something that you're seeing on a smaller scale, I think that's easier to look at.
Yeah. And Greg, I don't know why you were so nervous. That was a great answer. But I think that really aligns with some of the research that Joelle and Killian has put out there and really advocated for around assessing impact, is this idea that, if you have a clear logic model where you're defining what outcomes your program's going to have, that it's the key is being clear about which outcomes come and when. And so defining like short-term outcomes may be that educators are just building the knowledge needed to implement the program. And so and midterm outcomes are seeing large-scale shifts in instructional practice, whereas those long-term outcomes are student achievement. And so if you've collected data on all three of those buckets, then you have a pretty strong case that it is at least correlated to your professional learning.
And I would say that we are at the beginning stages of that, because just like you said, it takes time to implement. So we've been working with schools in this process in-depthly like this for a couple of years. And so we know it probably takes longer than a couple of years to see maybe changes in that student achievement. But what we are starting to have conversations about is how can we take the implementation data and look at those teachers that are implementing highly with fidelity, and then taking a look at some of their student achievement data. We have a screening, we have a state screener that we can use in the area of literacy, but probably more importantly, that is sitting down with that district and looking at formative assessment or whatever it might be. But we really are just at the beginning stages of trying to talk about and think about how do we do exactly that? How do we look at these teachers that we think are implementing at a high level, and are we starting to see some changes in student achievement? But we aren't there yet.
Yeah, great. And I have, let's see, one more audience question, just misplaced. And this is actually asked in absentia because Rosalind couldn't join us today. But she asked, how do you reflect on the biggest factor that impacted the implementation, or reflect on one piece of the implementation and how you addressed a key part of it and put it into place, which actually, let's just scratch that. I think we've already answered that on the call. I'm sorry, guys. But I do have one more question because I'm not out of questions personally. I think one of the things that we find a lot when people are starting to think about implementing a new program and putting into place this is that it sounds inspirational, but also scary, that this sounds like a lot, right? And so I guess in the last, 2 minutes that we have before we close out, I'd love to hear from either of you about advice you would give someone who's watching this webinar, who wants to start doing this work, but is afraid of taking that first step.
Well, you hear this a lot, but my advice would be go slow to go fast. So start small. Start small, start in one small area. We have schools that have even just started with a grade level. But just knowing that it's going to take time, and it's going to take time for people to learn. I mean, as a team, that's what we learned. We had to start really small, and then we're growing it. And we maybe are growing it almost too fast because it's getting kind of like crazy. But just know there's going to be bumps along the road, but you're learning together, and it's the process that's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. We've had we've tried and gone too fast at times here in Youngstown, so definitely a pain point. But at the same time, don't be afraid to go out and try it. And Kim hits the nail on the head with saying start small. It's about kind of knowing your audience, so to speak. How well is your building or your district? How open are they to trying something new? How much of a time is this going to be for us to learn and know and do? And kind of plot that out carefully in your planning. And maybe just start with something simple to test to see, okay, is this down the road going to be feasible, or am I, jumping into something too big and have to even start with an even smaller step? So kind of like test your waters, so to speak.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks, guys. You guys ended pretty perfectly on time. And because we are a feedback company, of course, we have at least one more poll in here. And really what I'm asking those of you who are still on the line today is, which of the following professional learning topics are of interest for your future webinars? We really try to be connected to what practitioners are looking for more help with, or to hear from the experts like Kim and Greg who are living this and doing this work. And so if you just take a second to respond to that poll about what you're most interested in learning more about. I also want to, as promised, allude to a couple goodies we have for those of you who are on the call. And what you're going to get from us, if you haven't checked out the KickUp blog, I promise this is not just because I'm paid to say it, but I really, really encourage you to jump on kickup.co/blog. There are a lot of great free resources there. There are also specifically that I wanted to point you towards is kickup.co/midyear PLCs. We actually hosted a conversation that was similar to this, looking at mid-year alignment, but around PLCs, because we know that PLCs are a really great strategy, but sometimes, to be honest, sometimes they can go off the rails a bit. So this resource is some tips for getting PLCs focused and aligned with your strategic work. And so you'll get this in an email from us. We promise no spam, just value. So we'll send you a copy of this article, a little freebie to thank you for joining us. And then we'll also make sure to send you a recording of today, just in case you want to get a closer look at some of those slides or replay pieces. But other than that little housekeeping note, I mostly just want to say thank you to Kim and Greg. Thank you to the people in the audience who were so active today in submitting questions. You really helped us have a great conversation. So thank you so much. And we look forward and hope you'll join us next time. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.